what has happened to me up to now has happened to me because I'm a socialist Muslim woman, Bangladeshi woman, ethnic minority member of the party who has become the MP. I'm not going to be one of those people that is going to be silenced about my experiences and the way in which I view what has happened up to now, which is the use of my ex-husband and empowering him to continue his abuse and harassment to get rid of me for factional purposes.
3 months ago, an MP and survivor of domestic abuse was admitted to hospital following what she called a sustained campaign of misogynistic abuse and harassment from within her party. Weeks earlier, the party leadership had been warned that this would happen, and they did nothing. Apsana Begum always knew she had her work cut out for her. When she was first elected to Parliament in 2019, aged just 29, she was Britain's first hijabi MP and one of the few remaining socialists in the Labour Party. What Begum could never have predicted, however, was that from a trumped-up housing fraud trial to a corrupt trigger process, the Labour Party would enable her ex-husband to continue his abuse, pushing her to the brink. But if anyone thought that Apsana Begum would go quietly, they were mistaken. On the eve of Labour Party conference, the MP for Poplar and Limehouse returns to work, and this time she isn't staying silent. Apsana Begum, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me.
So in June, you put out a statement saying that you've been signed off sick following what you described as a sustained campaign of misogynistic abuse and harassment. Tell us about the events leading up to that, which date, all the way back to your former marriage.
Yeah, I got married in 2013 under very difficult circumstances. My father had just passed away about 5 months before that, and things were very difficult for me. I was, I revered my father, and he was a really, really big inspiration for me in my life and in my politics. But that relationship was very abusive, and I was very isolated. I had no family. I had a limited number of friends, but eventually they were threatened too. So that was a very lonely period of my life as well. And I still remember the weeks before I left and I escaped. I had to wait until he had an appointment outside of London to actually make the move. And in the morning, I just decided in the morning like that was going to be it. And I started packing things but hiding it. But even leading up to that, things had got so bad, and with the alcohol and the violent outbursts, that I found myself I was living in the living room, going to work in the morning, but waiting just to make sure he wasn't around or he wasn't awake. But sleeping with the sofa and the dining table backed up on the door, because I just didn't want it to continue. And I did fear for my life, because there wasn't anybody there. I didn't have my own family. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There was no family. So I thought if something was to happen, there'd be no witnesses. Yeah. And things I've learned over the years after reading and after getting support, I've managed to understand it a bit more. The tactics and the things to draw somebody back in, to make them feel guilty about escaping, or trying to escape, having your own needs and wanting your own needs to be met, whether that's just to be free of someone. I think what's painful for me is just that, I just want to be able to move on with my life now. I'm 32. I just want to be able to move on from him and what he's doing, but my ex-husband has continued to carry out his actions and activities, and through the means of the Labour Party. Yeah,
because this was a man that you met through your involvement with the Labour Party. You were both working for the then Mayor of Tower Hamlets, Lutfur Rahman, a Labour mayor, and he was a sitting councillor in the borough. Is that right?
At that time, he wasn't a sitting councillor. He was an activist. Okay. And I'd met him there. You're correct. I met him there in that office he wasn't there very long, but he took a very keen interest in me, lobbied to stay in touch with me, and things progressed from there on. 7 years older than me, and, he was very manipulative from the beginning, but I was in some ways very young and inexperienced, and I wasn't able to see all those red flags at that time, which, I try not to, punish myself and feel guilty about. But there were red flags. I just couldn't see them. I couldn't see the way in which, even before the time I married him, I was fully under his control. And, once you don't have that foundation, your family support is gone, your foundation is not there, and you're starting a new life, you're isolated already from any support networks, any different perspective that might be able to help you get alerted to what might be happening to you. And it was only when I reached out to having therapy, the first therapist that I did have, I told my ex-husband about and said I desperately need it because I was missing my family so much, my younger sister, my mum in particular, and I just really needed help. I wasn't able to concentrate properly at work in the way, I took a lot of pride in my work. I couldn't concentrate as much as I wanted to, and I could see it was really starting to affect me now. But he was very reluctant for me to see the therapist that I chose to see, because I felt that the area in which they had expertise in was relevant to me, and I stopped seeing that therapist because my ex-husband was not happy. And he said, I don't want you to see that. It's a male therapist as well. I don't want you to see that therapist. Even the subsequent therapist that I saw, he tried to report her through to her regulators saying that she'd interfered. But I saw light through the therapeutic support that I got about the reality of my situation and the violent outbursts, the alcohol-ridden behaviours, the thumping on the door, the throwing the utensils around, the monitoring, and the level in which I had to report around finances. I wasn't allowed to, had to share my passwords. So I didn't have that basic independence, like just I'm an individual too. There wasn't that element in that relationship.
And so therapy helped you to realise this, and then, a couple of years into your marriage, you, as you say, you escaped. But that wasn't the end of it. And as you say, your husband continued to control you, but this time through the means of the local Labour Party. Can you tell us a little bit about that? The process from leaving your husband right up until you're becoming selected and then elected as the MP for Poplar and Limehouse, and how your husband attempted to kind of get back into and control your life through the party.
Yeah. There was definitely a period of time where I was almost like on the run, hiding. I eventually reconciled with my family, but there was definitely a period of time where it was like I was off grid because I was so afraid of him finding me. And, there were instances where he had followed me from work, stopped me in public spaces, tried to humiliate me, threatened to reveal things about me on his social media. Things that I did eventually conjure up the courage to go to the police about. After a period of time, when I started engaging with Labour Party activities, he suddenly one day turned up, and I was just frozen.
Turned up where?
He turned up in a meeting which wasn't a Labour Party meeting, but it was a meeting of activists. He seemed to know everybody's name in the room. Everyone got this weird feeling that he seemed to know me. I didn't tell anybody who he was. I was just too afraid, and I was just in shock that he turned up and he found me. At that point, maybe I just thought, I just can't, there's just nothing I'm going to be able to do to just get away from him. But yes, he continued his behaviour in various different ways, and culminating in when I decided to stand to the end. And I was an activist. I was a member of the party. I was my branch secretary. I was the equalities officer of the constituency Labour Party. I was also secretary. I became eventually then, the trajectory of becoming more active and more involved. I became the first British Bangladeshi woman secretary of the Tower Hamlets Labour Party. And a couple of years after that, the the process is going to start to select the MP. And as soon as I, put my name forward and put myself forward, his attacks really, it was a level that I still struggle to understand to this day, because just of the viciousness and the venom that he had with it. From, I think, the first hustings I ever did was the local Momentum group. He was there. He refused to leave. He had attacked me in a meeting when I was chairing a meeting. He'd verbally abused me in a meeting before that. He refused to leave in this meeting, which was the hustings, for people to decide if they wanted to support me. And when I made public my application and that I'd applied to stand as the candidate, he contacted members of my campaign team with very clear messages that I need to step down, I need to not go through with this process, or things will come out about me, and that he will tell the community, the local community, about me, the real Apsana, and that I'm not fit for office. And there's a whole history that, people would be ashamed to learn about when it came to me. At that time, I could think of maybe a few things that maybe, people who hadn't really known me before may sort of, if they heard from him, might have some questions about, that I was maybe ashamed about inside. And I've talked about this when later on in the courtroom, about the abortion that I'd had, about my personal history.
You threatened to share photos of you not wearing your headscarf. That's right.
He definitely had photos of me without my headscarf. He had some of my diaries. He had, this was the person I was married to, the person I thought was going to spend the rest of my life with, the person that I didn't recognise immediately as abusive. But, there were things I still I have not been able to gain possession of. That he still has a level of, he owns a level of the vulnerability that I was in those years. And so definitely, I felt that, those threats didn't make sense to me, apart from he's got something on me that he wants to reveal. At no point did I ever think that there were these allegations that would then, come out about me, about, alleged crimes of housing fraud. What seemed to me to be the case was that he appeared to be going around telling people that, you don't know some, I know things about her you don't know. And these are really shameful things. And if you learnt about it, you'd be quite ashamed too.
And then obviously, as we know, you won this election, you won the election, but that wasn't the end of it. In fact, your ex-husband stepped up the campaign against you in quite a significant way. Can you tell us a bit about the housing fraud trial that you were subjected to, and your ex-husband's implication in that, as well as, his connections with people who were involved in that prosecution, like the mayor, the regional party and so on?
The day that the nomination papers were due to be submitted to confirm me officially as the Labour Party's candidate, I received a call which was from a journalist, and who asked me to confirm things that wouldn't necessarily be publicly available widely, things that maybe, I don't know, your ex-husband might have information around, or maybe stored in a council somewhere. I can't say for sure that these are the sources of where these things came from, but somebody's asking you to confirm your little sister's date of birth and your mum's name. It does definitely hit a spot of vulnerability. And they said, that I was being investigated for housing fraud. I'd not received anything to say that I was. My initial reaction was not to think of anything of it, because by that time I'd had smear after smear, allegation after allegation of all sorts, being thrown at me in that election. So a lot of which, the core of which was my ex-husband. So I thought, this is just another one of his games. I'm just going to ignore it, and I'm just going to continue working. And it was a short election. But, a complaint, well, what we know now and what we know through the trial is that a complaint was put in by my ex-husband's brother-in-law. For some reason, no one seemed to think that there might be a slight conflict of interest if by 2018 my ex-husband is a sitting Labour councillor in my constituency, and, he's in a position of political oversight. If he's, sitting on the housing subcommittee, working with, the former mayor, John Biggs, who it's, I don't share the same, political beliefs as in the Labour Party. There's no hiding about the fact that I was very clear about my politics and advocating against austerity, against cuts that were being implemented nationally as well as locally, well before I had any ideas or any ambitions to represent local constituents. And so, Mayor John Biggs and I did not see eye to eye when it came to things like protecting our local public nurseries. So here are two people, in this scenario, and then the brother-in-law who puts in the complaint.
Yeah.
And as was said in the courtroom, why did nobody who was investigating this, anybody who was investigating this at a council officer level, a council bureaucrat, why did they not question the independency of this, or whether it needed to, if there were conflicts of interest, really obvious conflicts of interest in the way in which this case was being investigated and the allegations were being put forward. And I think that rests quite heavy with me, but I think it rests heavy partly because we're talking about, it was the Labour-run council.
Yeah.
And at that time, I wasn't reached out to by, the Labour leadership. There was silence. And, there was no support that came in either at that time.
Even though I imagine you must have been really suffering psychologically from this drawn-out process that lasted over a year, I think, from the time that you first were notified to the trial itself. So you had no support whatsoever from the Labour leadership.
I mean, I'm grateful for my office team, my campaign team, many local members, many members of the local community, Refuge, Women's Aid, Samaritans, like things were so bad for me that you do consider, the prospect of being thrown into prison and just your whole life kind of stops. And there were real moments, definitely, of you contact the Samaritans because you might not want to live anymore.
Gosh.
And I saw that happening to me, and I think what that case brought up for me was just the sheer, it was the sheer venom and the sheer viciousness in the way in which it was pursued, and the fact that we are talking about this case which was riddled with assumptions and biases about, I think, minority communities, about women, about domestic abuse survivors, but at the heart of it was, again, it was my ex-husband.
And in the end, you were cleared of all charges. They were found to be kind of unfounded. How did you feel when you got that verdict?
I had a sense of relief, and I felt a relief for local people, but I do despair sometimes about, the way in which, people are treated, and who knows who else is going through a process like this in the local council. I might have had, a privilege in maybe by the time of becoming an MP, the social capital, and people I could say, what's happening, can you help me? But local people might not necessarily have that network. Yeah. Or that ability to be able to say, like, this is what's happening and it's wrong, and how is the council sort of got these vested powers where they can try and prosecute you and throw you into prison for like jail sentences of like 10 years. But I think it does for me. I think a lot of constituents have said to me, that the Labour Party has got questions to answer on this. How did a Labour-run council do this? What was the national leadership doing and saying throughout this entire period?
Do you see any echoes between what happened to you and, the trial of Lutfi Rahman all those years ago, and the kind of underlying, as you say, prejudices and Islamophobia that might motivate some of that, legal action?
I think what's very clear is that what has happened to me up to now has happened to me because I'm a socialist Muslim woman, Bangladeshi woman, ethnic minority member of the party who has become the MP. That is why this has happened to me. I don't see any other reason why it's happened to me. I don't see any other reason why I'm being treated so awfully by the Labour Party, the hierarchy, the leadership, and how I can be treated in this way, but there can be more sympathy and more care and more attention given to the well-being of other MPs, not from the other Labour Party MPs that are not from the same background as me. I don't know how anybody could look at this situation and say that what is happening to me is happening for any other reason other than factional desire, and factional desire outweighing, the common decency, the basic decency, basic human rights of somebody from my background. And what I will say is this: I think we have to look at who gets support and who doesn't get support, and why some people get support and why other people don't get support. And it's very clear to me that I haven't got support, despite the fact that because of my background and because of the fact that I'm from minority background, I'm the first hijab wearing MP in Parliament. You would think that there would be more support provided, even more than the average person in the Labour Party coming up as an MP from the grassroots local file and rank of the Labour Party, becoming the MP. Think that there'd be more support, but it's been the exact opposite. It's been even less than somebody who isn't from these backgrounds, who isn't going to face the kind of challenges in public life that I would, given the way I look and the background that I'm from.
Do you think that it's kind of neglect? Do you see it as like an oversight on the Labour Party's part, or do you think that it's something more active and deliberate?
Look, I think there are definitely things that need to be improved on. So I when I gave my maiden speech, and it was on International Women's Day, I talked about the Labour Party's track record, a proud track record and history on the rights of women and women's rights, and I'm proud of that history. But what's happened to me makes me question that record, and I think that of course there's things to do. There are areas that need to be worked on. We need a domestic abuse policy in the party. A sexual harassment procedure is not sufficient to it doesn't apply the same way necessarily. There's sometimes an overlap, sometimes isn't, to domestic abuse survivors. So there is that work to be done. There are experts by experience. There are expert organisations. There are members with lived experience who can help inform these gaps in policy. But I'm very clear about that. There is that. But this what has happened to me is a factional battle. It's happening because I'm seen and I am viewed as a problem because I supported Jeremy Corbyn to be leader. I'm a socialist. That is who I am. That is why I advocate on behalf of my constituents who elected me to do that. I represent a seat where, against the tide of losses in the last general election, I increased Labour's majority in the seat that I represent, which is a sign that people wanted to see the policies that we had in the 2019 manifesto delivered. And that's the platform that I stand on. So I can't... what is happening is as a result of a factional battle that is being played out in the party, and Popular Naim House and me as the MP is the site of that battle. It is a site of what the Ford report has talked about and has warned about and has said should not happen. That is what is happening here.
Just to go back to the history, we've brought you up to the trial where you were cleared after a spurious allegation made against you by your ex-husband's brother-in-law. The fallout of that for you psychologically, it sounds like, has been pretty massive. And then, then we get to the trigger process, which precipitates your departure from politics, temporary departure from politics. It now transpires this year. Can you tell us about, what happened there and how the Labour Party, both locally and nationally, has been involved in what's happened?
I mean, certainly after the trial, I've continued to engage in the Labour Party's complaints process, specifically the one around sexual harassment. And, like the average domestic abuse survivor, maybe, you'd go in with this bit of a cynical hat about how much justice that can bring you. And I've not felt the protection from my party against my ex-husband. Quite the opposite. I feel like he's being facilitated to continue his abuse and harassment of me. I think the Labour Party have played such a bad role in doing that. I don't think they've just allowed it to happen. I think they are doing that to me. And I think the London Labour Party are extremely complicit in that, because that's what it appears to me to be, a facilitation of him at the core of a reselection and trigger process to oust me, to take me down.
Yeah. So every MP, as we know, in between general elections within the Labour Party is subject to a trigger process where local members are allowed to decide whether or not they want to keep the MP or put them up for a kind of competitive process alongside other candidates. Sometimes that procedure is waived, as it was in 2019, I believe, with Ellie Reeves, sister of Rachel Reeves, who was pregnant at the time. Corbyn intervened to waive her reselection process. But with you, this hasn't been waived, and on the contrary, it's been allowed to go ahead. Can you tell us a little bit about, your ex-husband, who, as you say, remains very influential in the local area and in the CLP, his involvement in that, and how some of that has obviously not been conducted according to Labour Party processes?
Yeah. I mean, I have given so much evidence to the Labour Party, things that I had to get special permission from the courts to disclose to the Labour Party, evidence after evidence, witness statements, to outline how my ex-husband, carried out his abuse and then furthered it as a member of the party. And yet he still is able to continue and is able to play a leading role in this trigger ballot process. I think partly because he's being actively facilitated by other members in the local and national and regional party. The evidence is there is very obvious who his allies are and who he's, whose weddings he's going to, who he's photographed with. He was still, as a suspended member, photographed with Mayor John Biggs just before the local elections concluded this year. But that is difficult to digest, to see that a Labour Party at any level can allow, whilst somebody is being investigated, suspended because they are seen to be a safeguarding threat, a risk of harm to myself or to others, to be seen fit to be campaigning with the mayoral candidate for the Labour Party in the local elections. Right. So I think the evidences are there very clearly about how, his allies and those with significant influence at various levels of the party, from the local, regional to right the way to the national, are, facilitating him and making him part of the target that I am to oust me. And that is what I see, that I am this target to be got rid of using my ex-husband. And I think there can be, there are, the depths of immorality to engage with, to do that, but it's happening right in front of our eyes.
Yeah. And the trigger process has been subject to dozens of complaints, ranging from vote rigging to other kinds of kind of rule breaking activity. Why do you think the parties allowed that to go ahead? Not only that, obviously half of the process was conducted whilst you were off sick, something that the party actually denied. They denied having even received a sick note from you in the beginning, and then eventually conceded that they had. Why do you think the party has allowed this process, which has been subject to so many complaints, and half of which took place when you weren't even able to campaign, to go ahead?
I mean, I think, engaging with the Labour Party's sexual harassment procedure, which didn't feel like was the right procedure for me to engage with, before going on trial, during the trial, after the trial, and then less than a year later, undergoing the reselection process with my ex-husband at the heart of it, I think it probably would. I think it's fair to say, would kill anybody, over. And it finally caught up with me. I just couldn't react and accept what was happening, and therefore something gave way. Why the party can allow that to happen? Sorry.
Don't take your time.
Yeah, it's really it's a good question. It's really inhumane to allow it to happen, but as it's been mentioned, I've mentioned it before as well. I mean, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, there wasn't a precedent around people who were pregnant, but it got made as a result of Ellie Reeves being pregnant, the question does come up, definitely, like, why is this allowed to happen? And I genuinely think that if the left were in power in the party, they would be able to suspend factionalism and apply basic courtesy in this. And so the fact that it hasn't been applied in this process, the fact that the process was allowed to continue, so pleading and saying, like, I can't participate. You can't expect me to keep facing my ex-husband like this. Please, like, stop this right now. Like, just, it tells me that it's for factional reasons. Mm-hmm. It's more important to oust somebody like me because of my politics, because of my socialist beliefs, because of the background that I have, because of the way I look. It's more important to factionally oust me than it is to, apply any sense of decency or mercy in the situation. And it is quite hard to digest that, because it really, I think about what it means for local constituents from the same background as me and others that are not from the same background as me, that we can get treated so badly. I wasn't naive to the cut and thrust of politics and what it entails. We locally know how we've had bad policies, applied to us exceptionally over the last few decades, even by the Labour Party. But I think the reality of it still hits quite hard, that, above everything was this idea that I must be ousted because of my political beliefs, and just for being a socialist, just for being Muslim, just for being Bangladeshi woman, hijab wearing woman. Like, this is what it is telling me right now.
Your statement is very strongly worded about the experiences that you've had in the Labour Party. Did you get a call from Keir Starmer after you publicly announced that you were off sick?
No, nothing from Keir, nothing from Angela.
Yeah. Have you had any contact with them since then?
Nothing from them. Nothing. I reached out to David Evans, the leader's office. I believe my family contacted when I didn't have my phone on me, so my sisters have informed me that they reached out at various different levels: the Labour Party, the chair, the leader's office, the leader, Keir, David Evans, and it's, in any other scenario, the phone would definitely be picked up. Mm-hmm. There would be a response, there would be a reply, there would be just, a concern.
Yeah.
In the same way that I've shown concern when I've had colleagues, in the Labour Party come out on the dispatch box and say that they're survivors of domestic abuse and they've had bad experiences. I've reached out to them. They're not necessarily, their political beliefs don't reflect exactly the same as mine. But that is, you extend your hand out to support others in that way.
Have members of other parties been supportive of you where the Labour leadership hasn't?
Yeah, I think definitely before my trial, I had some Tory MPs reach out. I have, as I understand, I think a few Tory MPs have reached out to my office after I've gone off sick. So there has been, some solidarity and some concern expressed from Tory leagues. How
does it feel to work for a party that doesn't pick up the phone when you say that you've basically broken down after a campaign of misogynistic abuse?
I think it's really hard to take that because, going into public life, coming from the background that I'm from, we're always going to face challenges on a national platform. Islamophobia is rampant in society. It's getting worse. Anti-Semitism is getting worse. These hate crimes are on the rise. Religiously motivated hate crimes are on the rise. So I probably one of the ones that probably needed more support than others because of the background that I was coming from. And, I've not felt that support come through from the party. It's been the opposite. It's like being thrown to the wolves. and having every type and every level of attack, come at you. I still remember, that the type of reporting that there was, before the trial concluded, the warnings that were issued, the judge issuing warnings to the press about reporting matters in a way as though I was already convicted. After I cleared my name, or before I cleared my name, but the safety warnings, the police being contacted, the death threats, the judge saying I needed to leave through the back of the courtroom, things like that. These are times when you need to be reached out, not just by your colleagues, but your leader.
Yeah. Do you think Keir Starmer would have sat back and let the worst happen?
I think that's where things were heading. That's definitely where things were heading. I could have been thrown into prison for 10 years. Mm-hmm. That's where things were heading, and I did not feel any sense of support coming through that was in any shape or form meaningful in that period and since. And so when you see what is happening with my ex-husband at the heart of the process, and you sort of see all the people around him at every single level, then you know that this is being done. I'm being targeted. I'm being targeted by the Labour Party. I'm being targeted to be removed as the MP for Poplar, as the Labour Party candidate in the next general election, because I'm a socialist, because of my politics, because I'm a Muslim woman of Bangladeshi origin. I'm working class, and they don't want us to represent people that are like us in Parliament.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've been raising the alarm for a number of years now. Do you feel like you've been taken seriously by the Labour Party as a survivor of domestic abuse?
I've lost confidence now in this complaints process, which has now taken 1.5 years. I've been very lucky to have the support of an independent domestic violence advocate who's literally held my hand through the process. Whilst a complaint is being investigated, there are multiple things that are happening in that period as well. So, of course, respondents got to reply, things are going to be investigated. What do I do about the fact that I've got a local businessman that calls me up after my trial, happens to be the day after my ex-husband is handed something as part of this complaints process? So I'm supposed to believe there's no coincidence in this at all. But calls me up, this local businessman, and says to me, back off the local mayor of Tower Hamlets, back off John Biggs. And I'm saying, why? What is it I've done? So, you're too critical of him. You need to back off. If you don't, he's come and seen me yesterday. And I said, well, what has he come and seen you about? He said, he came with an envelope from your ex-husband.
Wow.
And that was a real threat.
Yeah.
And I reported that to the party as well when it happened last year after the trial.
Mm-hmm.
It was around the time when my ex-husband he had his suspension removed. And that was deemed as apparently because he was no longer a threat, providing a threat of immediate harm to myself or others. Actually, in the period after the trial, reminded me pretty much of like the period just after I left my ex-husband. When people say domestic abuse survivors, the most dangerous period in your life is when you leave or when you escape. Mm-hmm. When I came out of that trial, I felt like my life was at risk. Because of what I had to say. I was cross-examined on domestic abuse in the courtroom. I had to say things that I didn't want to ever have to say, but I had to say it. I had to say, this is what's happening. Can people join the dots here? This is very unusual. How can it be that my ex-husband's brother-in-law puts in a complaint that leads to an investigation where apparently domestic abuse has no bearing on the case whatsoever? Nothing in terms of the investigation picked up about how domestic abuse may play a part in this or how it could have a bearing, what the consequences could be. Nothing in terms of like, is she at risk right now? Whilst my ex-husband is a sitting Labour councillor in a Labour-run council, sitting in the housing subcommittee, and where his brother-in-law puts in a complaint and had attended fraud committee meetings, and that there's nobody that's saying that there's any conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And I felt very vulnerable after that trial, because I had spoken out. I had to speak out, and I had to say this is what has been going on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned the independent domestic violence advocate that you've been working with, and obviously we reported a few weeks ago about how that advocate wrote to Keir Starmer and David Evans, telling them that the trigger process that you were going through was effectively an extension of the abuse that you'd suffered because of the people involved in it, many of whom are associates of your ex-husband. And as we know, he did nothing about it. Why do you think that is?
I also reached out to David Evans directly. I alerted lots of people in the party about what's happening and about this process, which I still to this day don't seem to know the full breakdown of the results for. I'm just getting back into things in terms of my work, but I'm very aware that I don't know, what the returns were in that trigger ballot process. Nobody will give it to me in the party. But what I will say is this: I think in terms of why this is happening to me, and why no one's doing anything about it. I mean, we've just come out of the Ford report being released, and that talks about factionalism. I think what has happened here, it's a real stain. It's a real, it's crushed any sense of decency and humanity, what has happened to me. And I fear for, Muslim members, Muslim women members, ethnic minority members, Black women, who are also members of this party, because of what I have gone through. I cannot turn around to them and say, it's a safe place to be right now in the party. I hope that can change. And when I delivered my maiden speech on International Women's Day, I spoke about my party's, track record on women's rights. But I can't look at the situation with what's happened to me and confidently say that it is safe to be an ethnic minority woman in the Labour Party right now. And I think the Ford report has highlighted that as well. I think, I look back at when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. I honestly cannot imagine a scenario. And there's instances where there wasn't precedent, but the precedent was made when, as far as I understand, women members of the PLP were granted exceptions or processes were paused because they were pregnant.
Yeah, Ellie Reeves.
And that hasn't applied in this scenario when I am saying I cannot function anymore. I've been signed off sick. I can't even get to my laptop. I can't do any work. And that hasn't applied. And, I think what I'm saying here is this, factionalism has been used as a tool against me as a Muslim ethnic minority woman to take me out. Mm-hmm. And my ex-husband has been used to carry that out. Mm-hmm. That's how awful this is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So would you go as far as to say that Keir Starmer has been complicit in your abuse?
I think, I've not had anything from him. He's not reached out to me in this process. I don't know why there would not be any basic level of decency and humanity in this scenario. I've had other colleagues come out about their experiences of domestic abuse who I've reached out to. Anna McMorrin, for example, spoke as a shadow minister for safeguarding and revealed at the dispatch box that she'd experienced domestic abuse. I think the only reason why that level of decency cannot be applied to me from my leader is because of, the factional desires are far more important apparently and outweigh, the basic human rights of a working class Muslim Bangladeshi ethnic minority woman who's an MP.
Mm. Do you think Keir Starmer is fit to lead a Labour Party that's supposed to represent and defend people exactly like you?
I think we can look at what's happening in this country and we can look at who the most vulnerable are in our society. And as we're seeing, even with most recent by-election result in Bolton, there is a breakdown of trust among ethnic minority communities and the Labour Party. The policy positions that have changed over the last 2 years has been difficult for people to comprehend, to digest, and to believe that they can continue to support Labour in the current scenario. It's not good enough to rely on ethnic minority communities for donations, for funding, to rely on certain industries that the ethnic minority communities in this country are well represented in, whether that's the catering industry or other business industries where we thrive in, and to use that as a means to bat off criticism and bat off any insinuation that there is a real problem here. People are not having their basic human rights met, and members, including as we know with Jewish members in the way in which they've been expelled from the party, this is a real problem. And Poplar and Limehouse is a constituency which has huge amounts of poverty and a very diverse set of communities. And I do believe it is now the site, unfortunately, through this factional battle, it is now the site of the Ford report and what has come out of the Ford report. The battle is happening there, and it's almost like an existential crisis for Black, Asian, and ethnic minority members now in the Labour Party. Can they stay? Will they stay? Will they be ousted? Will they see their MP, continue to be, attacked in this way relentlessly? Why was it even on the table that she should be, thrown into prison? Mm-hmm. They can't accept that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned human rights just then. I wrote to the chair of the Joint House Committee on Human Rights, Harriet Harman, your colleague in the Labour Party. I also wrote to Jess Phillips, who, as you know, is the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence, asking them to comment on, the Labour Party's treatment of you, and in particular the revelations that Novara made about the correspondence between a domestic violence expert and Keir Starmer and David Evans, and neither of them would condemn the Labour Party's treatment of you. Do you feel betrayed by, feminist figureheads of the Parliamentary Labour Party?
I think there's definitely, a hierarchy in the way in which people's concerns are heard and the way in which people are supported. I definitely feel alongside, I'm sure, many of my Black and Asian sisters in the PLP, that, when we are alerting the party and when we are saying things are happening to us and we need support, that support is not coming through. Mm. In terms, you mentioned Jess Phillips, I reached out to her, she reached out to me. At various points, she did make representations to the party. But I'm just getting back into things right now, so I've got to catch up with her and find out where things are at. And I'll be doing that over the next few weeks.
Do you think there's been a reluctance from certain members of the Parliamentary Party to make public representations where they might have made representations in private?
I've definitely had I understand from my team that quite a few people that reached out. I mean, I don't know to what degree, because I didn't have my phone on me for quite of the last few weeks, and I'm just getting back and catching up on things. I think there's been a lot of expressions of support from all parts of the Parliamentary Labour Party, including Tory, but also Tory colleagues as well. Some who are survivors of domestic abuse themselves, horrified to hear what was happening, expressing concern and saying that there needs to be, like I've said in the past as well, and Refugee and Women's Aid have said in the past as well, that we've got work to do as political parties in terms of tackling domestic abuse as well. There need to be policies that are robust, that can protect members, from each other where these situations and incidents occur. But yes, I'm still catching up, so I don't know to what degree. But I think, I think there has been a stop, like a gap or a point in which some people stop in terms of public statements of support. And I think that still, again, points back to what you asked me earlier around, do factional desires outweigh, common decency and humanity? I am a human being. I'm the MP, and I believe, that I should engage in the cut and thrust of politics. But I'm either being thrown into prison, or I'm being made to feel ill, or I'm being harangued, by misogynistic attacks. There has to be a level here that is the same for everyone.
When you've tried to raise this issue to national media and kind of, ring the alarm about what's happening to you, what kind of response have you had? I haven't seen a huge number of stories in the national press. Have editors been interested in your story? Have you attempted to kind of raise the profile of it? And what response have you got?
I think definitely throughout the last 2 years, I still remember sort of trying to reach out for broadcast pictures around Islamophobia Awareness Month, and almost like a blanket sort of no or blanket silence from most of the mainstream media outlets. But I mean, I definitely see what I was navigating in the lead up to the trial when those allegations emerged and were then made public, and there seemed to be a steady stream of information being given to the press. I don't know from where, but some of those pieces of information later did come up in the courtroom, but I was just flabbergasted as to how the press got hold of information that would only ever be really stored securely somewhere. And the reporting seemed to be, and the online social media, abuse, Islamophobic, racist abuse, the media have a responsibility to report the truth, but all of these things sort of very much verged on untruth, on false allegations, on insinuating that this is how Muslim people are. Can't be trusted with money.
Yeah.
This is a financial case. This is about fraud.
Or just ignoring the case altogether. And when similar things happened, when, for example, Luciana Berger left the party in 2019 after what she described as a campaign of anti-Semitic abuse, this precipitated a huge national scandal and was one of the major catalysts for the formation of a new political party.
But definitely after the trial concluded, I definitely saw, when my side was going to be printed finally, when I could finally properly speak out, it was all, where they did report, there was always this caveat, that they would publish alongside it, which was my ex-husband's statement. No interrogation of his statement and what he's saying in that, just that there must be these two sides to the story, which was really hard to contend with, absolutely, because it's almost still giving air to somebody who's carried out abuse. So, not interrogating that, not questioning that, but just publishing that as a caveat, that was quite painful, definitely, after the trial.
Do you think the Labour leadership expected that after everything you've been through that you would just kind of quietly disappear from politics?
Oh, definitely. I think in a lot of ways, I think the expectation that people like us just won't be able to tolerate this level of distress, and, leaving is a safer option. The safety of a community that can hold you, a locality that can embrace you. I still remember one or two people, with who real supporters of mine, did on my journey to becoming the MP, saying, they're probably gonna, it's gonna be hard. National level, national platform is gonna be hard, and you're the first hijab-wearing MP, it's gonna be hard. So yeah, I think there's a degree that I think in which, anybody facing this level of attack, the party hierarchy and the leadership may just think, well, this all keeps going, and she's gonna break, and she's gonna just be here and go away. But I have a responsibility to local people. They put me there, they put me in this position. And what has happened to me has not just happened to me, it happened to them. And that's what I feel responsible about. I've mentioned before, do I think what happened, what other people are going through if they have false allegations put against them of housing fraud and what they have to endure as a result of it, or as a result of that. And people want, their political voice. They want their political voice. That is why they elected me, to fulfill that. I was a vessel through which they could fulfill their political ambition. And we're talking about, in an area where, we've had bad policies applied exceptionally to us, special measures for 20 years. My father's generation of activists who were denied the right to join the Labour Party because they were told the party was full, and they're not willing to just be silenced. I'm not willing to be silenced for that reason.
You mentioned the Ford report earlier, and in response to it, Keir Starmer put out a statement saying, this was a Corbyn problem, Labour's under new management, we don't have the same problems with racism and so on that beset my predecessor. What do you make of those kind of claims that Labour is a different party to the one that it was?
It's a different party than the one that was under Jeremy Corbyn, which was trying to empower people, people-powered democracy and greater democratisation of the Labour Party. That's, in my view, what Corbynism was about. What we now have is a top-down approach, which is silencing members. That is what is happening, silencing members and stopping people from speaking out. I'm not going to be one of those people that is going to be silenced about my experiences and the way in which I view what has happened up to now, which is the use of my ex-husband and empowering him to continue his abuse and harassment to get rid of me for factional purposes. The statement from the leader of the Labour Party is is the exact opposite of what the Ford report was talking about. But one thing I will say about the Ford report is that the Ford report does talk about the toll and the well-being of people that have been impacted by all those things that happened. We talk about Diane Abbott and the abuse that she has suffered, but she faces abuse relentlessly in the public, and that is something that she has to contend with every single day. But to face it from party officials, people that are supposed to be on your side, or even acting as the Ford report recommends, acting like civil servants, really, that didn't happen. The impact of that can be long lasting. And I think, the Ford report mentions that for a reason, because what is happening is having an impact on what continues to happen in the name of factionalism, is having such a huge impact on, people who come from diverse backgrounds.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, what do you want Keir Starmer and the Labour Party to do for you at this point? Is it waive the selection process? Is it other kinds of support? Tell us what you want from them.
I think the trigger ballot process has to be ruled out of order, very and simple, because, as I've mentioned, there are serious allegations here about, of electoral fraud, of bribery, of harassment, intimidation. And I think, there is, people have all sorts of experiences in society of misogyny and of abuse, of harassment, of intimidation. We are in a privileged position to do something about it as a political party. So that the work has got to start here before we go out and advocate to the rest of the country that we are a party fit to govern. So there is work to be done here. I think the work can be done. But I think in my situation itself, of course, the trigger ballot process needs to be ruled out of order. Mm-hmm. I'll give you another example. Amy Fordy, the London Regional Director, I contacted them along with my agent, to confirm just the basics of the trigger process. Can you confirm the name of the affiliates to my local constituency Labour Party? They were confirmed at the start of the process. I asked again, I think two times further, to confirm that list, and she wrote back and she said, "This is the list. There's no questions about it. This is the list, and this is the list that we're working on." Halfway through the process, of course, that changes, and apparently there are 2 new affiliates mm-hmm. to my local CLP that I wasn't aware of, and the mad rush to get materials for those members. So there are serious breaches, allegations of serious breaches that need to be investigated here at all levels. My ex-husband, his allies sit very firmly in the way in which they're operating with the London Regional Labour Party, and that needs itself to be investigated in full, because I see all of that treatment to be as part of one big operation here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We spoke a lot, or the media spoke a lot during Corbyn's tenure about an anti-Semitism crisis. Do you think there should be a crisis around the experience that you've had and the treatment of people of colour, women, and other kinds of groups within the Labour Party?
I think, I do, because I think those of us that are going through experiences like this are not just going to be sitting at home doing nothing. We will be active, and we will be activists in some form or other. So it's not something that they can just ignore and think it's going to go away. Those women, the Black and ethnic minority members, the Jewish members, they're not going to go away. They are going to be, wanting justice of some form and fairness in some form. So I think it's imperative for the Labour Party to really start dealing with this now, and not think that this is, a good electoral strategy to just completely, ignore and disown these communities. I think it could have quite negative, serious consequences in lead up to a general election, for example.
Your work clearly isn't done. That's why you've returned to politics. What is it that you hope to achieve in the next months, year, as the MP for Poplar and Limehouse?
I think, firstly, just going back to, really represent my constituents. And, the cost of living crisis is something that is really, really impacting local people. It's pretty unprecedented in the way in which it's affecting local people. I mean, like this time last year, I was speaking to constituents about the universal credit uplift and how cuts were impacting them. Now it's almost like, at the point of despair for people, not knowing how they are going to be able to cope and survive through this winter period. If I look back at if I look back at the 2019 manifesto, and at the heart of it was nationalisation of the energy sector and other sectors, that was the direction we needed to go then. And now if I look at the situation, we need to go even further in that direction, more than before. And so I want to be a part of advocating for that on behalf of local people. And that is my focus. And that is going to be my focus. I think more broadly, I think, I will continue to campaign around domestic abuse. I will continue to talk about the issues that are affecting members and not accept the kind of treatment that people are having to endure. That is going to be a core part of my my work going forward as well.
Apsana Begum, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.